What is up, everybody? Welcome back to XJW Diaries. My name is Justin. I'm going to try to keep this intro as short as possible because we have a big topic today. We are going through the brand new 2025 edition, Shepherd the Flock of God, aka the Secret Elders Manual. Now, for me, this book is very, very interesting because this is the first Jehovah's Witness publication that I have studied from cover to cover since leaving the organization. So for me, it's very interesting to peer back into this organization after being away from it for so long. And it's kind of funny how everything just kind of comes back. Everything is right where you left it. Certain things have a different name, but in general, everything is right where you left it. Now, I apologize in advance because this video is probably going to be on the longer end because we are doing a full overview of the book. But again, this is just an overview. So if you want a more in-depth look at the book, please download it yourself. There are many places you can download it from. Just do a quick Google, Shepherd the Flock of God, 2025 edition. You can find it. Now, again, I don't want to make this intro too long, but just because this video is going to be on the longer side, I just want to say up front a couple of the things that really popped out to me while reading this book. The first thing is that the organization really expects way too much from these men. These men are expected to be the counselors, the police officers, the judges, the mentors, the teachers, and the list goes on for the congregation. That is just way too many hats for any man to wear. And in the real world, of course, a lot of those responsibilities require specialized training, especially in the case of a counselor, right? Now, the second thing that I wanted to say, and this is really for people who are just waking up, because when you're just waking up and you're listening to a video like this, we're going through all this information, it might be very easy to build up some anger and direct that anger towards the elders. And hey, you're completely justified in that, but I just want to remind you that as Jehovah's Witnesses, we were all under very intense mental conditioning, all of us. But you have to think how much more mentally conditioned you have to be in order to make it to the position of being an elder. How deep must that mental conditioning be for the organization to trust that they can put you in the place of an elder and know that you will do everything that this book says to a T without asking questions? That's a very deep level of conditioning. So again, if you feel angry by this stuff, you are completely justified. I felt angry while reading this stuff, but just keep that in the back of your mind of how much mental conditioning you would have to be under in order to follow this book. Now, one last thing I will say, stepping outside of the XJW perspective for a second, I would love for some university out there to do a study on this book, just from an anthropology perspective, because it is very, very interesting to see how you have these societies within a society that split themselves off. They create their own rule book, and from that rule book, you end up with these situations where there's things that are normalized within that society that in the regular world would be completely inappropriate. And of course, there's many other factors to it, but it would be very, very interesting just to see how that would be studied from a group of people that have never been witnesses. But with all that being said, let's get into this topic and let's see what the Secret Elders book really has to say. So let's get started with chapter 1, how elders work together as a body. Now, I'll just say real quick, again, this is an overview, and some of these chapters in this book are things that you would already know, and this is definitely the case with this first chapter. So for the most part, this chapter is just going over elders meetings, when they should be held, why they should be held, you know, what they are generally. And then it goes over every single elder position, the secretary and all the other positions, what they do and how they support one another and how they support the congregation. So again, stuff that you already know, but that is what the first chapter is all about. Now things get a little bit more interesting in chapter 2, shepherding. And as the name would suggest, this chapter is all about shepherding visits, when they should be handled, how they should be handled, and a lot of other details about shepherding visits. Now, one point that jumped out to me was point number 7, assisting sisters. It says, if it is not possible for an elder to speak with a sister while in full view of others, he should have another elder or a ministerial servant join him. An elder must never become the sole confidant of a sister who is not closely related to him. He should be alert to the possible dangers of communicating with a sister by text messages or other electronic means. Innocent communication could quickly lead to an improper shepherding, emotional attachment, and progress toward inappropriate expressions. If a sister needs ongoing assistance, it is best for different pairs of elders to shepherd her. Now, what's interesting about this is they focus so much on sin and trying to avoid temptation that they seem to just miss the solution that is right in front of them. And this is something that I even believed, and I talked to other sisters about this back when I was a faithful Jehovah's Witness. So the question is, why doesn't the Watchtower have some sort of leadership position, some sort of mentorship position that is for sisters, so that women can assist other women in a way that only another woman would be able to understand, or in a way that only a woman would feel comfortable talking to another woman? So it's kind of crazy that after doing all of these changes, that they wouldn't look at that and see, just for the sake of comfort, how important it would be to have the ability for sisters to have some sort of position that is looked at as a leadership position that is for the purpose of helping women to help other women. I mean, it just seems like that would be a no-brainer in a modern day society. Now, another interesting thing is in section 16, and this deals with victims of child abuse. And again, we see where the elders are being put in a position where they really have no specialized training of being in. Again, in this case, they're being asked to be basically counselors for a situation that really should require professional therapy. And that's why point number 4 really jumped out to me in this section. And it's that last part that I really don't agree with. Now, at first glance, this seems like a step in the right direction. This seems pretty innocent. They're basically saying if someone needs to get professional help, don't get in the way. That's definitely better than how things were in previous times. We know from the ARC that there was many cases where there was CSA, a known issue of CSA, and the elders were actively discouraging the parents from going to the authorities or getting any sort of professional assistance. But in reality, this is just the organization simply not doing enough. When it comes to the safety of a child and their environment, getting professional help should be mandatory, especially when it comes to CSA issues. Getting professional help and including the authorities should be mandatory. It's insane to me that this book is suggesting that an elder can have intimate knowledge of abuse, in some cases CSA, and all the organization is requiring them to do is to comfort them and basically act as a counselor that, again, they don't have any professional training for, and pray over them and read the Bible. And hey, that's good and fine, but for these type of things, there is not enough prayers, not enough scriptures to cover over that level of trauma. You cannot use the Bible as a Band-Aid. For some things, you really do need professional therapy. And when elders are not reporting these things, they are getting in the way of helping that child to actually be able to recover from these things, especially when you really put yourself in the mindset of a Jehovah's Witness, where an issue like this comes up, they go to the elders. The elder says, okay, we're going to investigate it. They pray over it. They read the Bible. Okay, it's in Jehovah's hands. And now to that person, they think it's solved. And that's just not the case. You know, it's in the real world, a child is, again, given professional therapy. The abuser is sent to jail. That's a 5 to 20-year sentence. So in my opinion, if an elder is put in their position where they are going to be given intimate details of situations like this, especially in the case of CSA, that elder should also be responsible for assisting that person with getting the professional help that they need. So now we move on to chapter 3. And chapter 3 is field ministry. And as you would suspect, this is all about the field ministry, going out in service. There's nothing really all that interesting in this chapter, but what is interesting is just how much this organization is ran like a corporation. For all this talk about being no part of the world, when you read this chapter, you really see how they operate much like any corporation in the world. And we see kind of the same thing in chapter number 4, meetings, which, as you would suspect, is all about meetings and how meetings should be held. And again, we see this very corporatized atmosphere that they have set up. This chapter makes it very, very obvious that elders are to stick to the script. And this is something that I noticed when I was serving as a ministerial servant, and I gave my very first public talk. When I finally received my very first talk outline, it was amazing to me just how controlled it was. You had very little room for adding your own words. Now that gets us into chapter 5, appointment and deletion of elders and ministerial servants. Now there's a couple things that really jumped out to me in this chapter. The first one is just how these appointments for elders and servants is very much based on outward appearances. And of course, we already knew this, but it's just kind of interesting to see it in writing from the elders manual, how much they care about the performative nature of being a witness. Now, one thing that I didn't know is kind of surprising when it comes to this attitude, this focus on appearances. I did not know that somebody could be refused being an elder or deleted from being an elder or a ministerial servant for filing for bankruptcy. I kind of figured that would be your own private financial information, but no. If you file for bankruptcy, depending on the natures of that filing, that may get you removed or disqualified from being an elder. Very interesting. The second thing that jumped out to me in this chapter was just how often they mention the subject of pornography. This is obviously a major issue for them, especially when it comes to appointing men. And from the outside looking in, it's funny because it's just like, well, of course that's an issue. You have a very sexually suppressed culture where nobody has any approved outlet other than to get married, and where they are constantly talking about sexual morality and the dangers of it and yada, yada, yada. So it kind of creates that pink elephant sort of effect. You have created a very sex-focused culture while at the same time also trying to create a purity culture. And when you mix those things together, you're going to end up with a situation where people have natural desires, but they have no healthy outlet for them. So they're going to come out in unhealthy ways. Simple math. So now we get into chapter 6, and we're definitely going to spend some time on this one and the next one and the one after that. So chapter 6 is determining whether a committee of elders should be formed. Now, here we see the name change from judicial committee to committee of elders, but don't let that fool you. This is still very much a judicial process. Now, in point number 4, we of course see the good old 2-witness rule. So it's sad to see that they still uphold this rule. Of course, we know that that rule has caused many people who have participated in CSA to be allowed to walk away free, simply because there wasn't 2 witnesses to that. Hardly ever is there going to be 2 witnesses in the case of CSA. And of course, this also goes beyond just minors, beyond children. In the case where women, full-grown women, sometimes even men, have been taken advantage of. Again, there's not 2 witnesses. The person goes away free. It's just not right. Now, point number 9 is interesting. It says, if the matter involves CSA, the coordinator of the body of elders should contact the circuit overseer before the body of elders selects elders to serve on the committee. The circuit overseer would designate an experienced elder to serve as chairman of the committee. He might be from another congregation in the circuit. Thereafter, the body of elders should select the other members of the committee. I thought that was just kind of interesting that in the case of CSA, they will actually bring an elder from another congregation, even from another circuit, in order to serve as chairman of the committee. I'm willing to bet you that in those cases where they bring somebody else in, that elder coming in is either a lawyer or an attorney or works in some other fashion where they know what to say and what not to say and how to document things so as to protect the organization, because you will see that theme here. When it comes to CSA, there is 4 words. Call the service department. That's it. Call the service department. They are here to protect themselves. Now, point number 11 is also very interesting. Let's read that. It is best for the meeting to be held at the Kingdom Hall. Generally, observers are not invited to the meeting. However, if the individual is a married brother and he wants his believing wife to be present, she may attend. If the individual is a married sister, it is best to have her believing husband present. As her head, he may be able to help her spiritually. 2 elders should call the service department if unusual circumstances are involved. For example, the committee might hesitate to invite the husband because of concerns for the wife's safety. So very, very interesting paragraph here, and it shows how this organization definitely views women somewhat lower. Here, if you are a married man, you have the option of having a private committee meeting. Whereas if you're a woman and you're married, they are going to push you to have your husband there. You don't get that privacy. It's also kind of interesting, the response to a case where perhaps the wife's safety might be in question if the husband is present. If you have this legitimate concern for the woman's safety, why isn't that man being investigated? It is crazy to me how in this organization, the safety of women and the safety of children is held to a much lower priority. So now let's move into chapter 7. Leading individuals to repentance. Now, this chapter explains how these committees should be handled and how the meeting should go overall. And again, even though they changed the name from judicial committee to committee, this is still very much a judicial process. And we can see that clearly in point number 5. Just look at the wording here. The chairman should invite the individual to make a personal statement. The elders should listen patiently and not draw any conclusions before they have heard all of the relevant facts. The elders should ask themselves, has a serious wrongdoing been scripturally established by a confession or by the testimony of 2 or 3 eyewitnesses? The committee should be thorough, but not inquire about needless details, especially in regards to sexual misconduct. However, details may need to be clarified if the matter involves scriptural freedom to remarry, or if the nature of the scriptural wrongdoing must be determined. So as you can see, this is still very much a judicial process. The individual gives a statement. The elders listen to that statement. They then judge that person based on how repentant they are, based on what their wrongdoing was, the details of that wrongdoing, and so on and so forth. Now, it is kind of interesting that they specify in this section that they are not to inquire about needless details of the matter, especially when it comes to sexual misconduct. Of course, we know that there have been many cases where mostly women have been asked all sorts of very highly inappropriate sexual questions, detailed sexual questions about their experiences, so that the elders can determine how repentant they are. And in some cases, this was even asked of women who are still minors. You're talking 15, 16, 17-year-olds, which in normal society would be highly inappropriate. In some cases, might even be considered illegal. Now, again, this is one of those cases where even though it's in the book, you got to wonder how closely this is being followed, right? Are those type of questions still being asked, or are they following along with this and keeping these committees more appropriate? You got to hope that it's the latter, because how traumatizing is it for a woman to have to explain in detail these things to 3 old men, especially in the case where the woman was being taken advantage of. So now let's skip down to point number 6, because something really interesting gets said here. It says, repentance involves a deep regret over a damaged relationship with Jehovah and the reproach it brings upon his name and people. It includes a rejection of the bad course and a longing to come back into Jehovah's favor. The goal of the committee is to lead the individual to repentance. The elders should be alert to see any sign of heartfelt repentance. Now, when I read this, number 1, again, it shows this is a very judicial process. The elders are in charge of judging how repentant a person is. But at the same time, you also got to wonder, how is the fact that the person is there in the committee talking to the elders about all their problems, why isn't that on its own showing that the person is repentant, right? If the person was not repentant, they would keep on doing whatever it is they're doing, keep it hidden to themselves. But they're there. They're talking about it. They're being open and honest. Is that not repentant enough? And how is it that man can judge how your relationship is with Jehovah versus you being the judge of that yourself? So now we need to skip down to section number 10, because something very concerning is in this section. It's all about reproof. And this section mostly goes through all the different reasons that a person may need to be reproved and how a reproof should happen. But the more concerning thing comes at the very bottom, in point number 2. This is talking about when a reproof should be announced to the congregation versus keeping the reproof private. So here's what it says. A reproof should always be announced to the congregation in the following situations. And of course, the first situation is if the sin is widely known or will become widely known in the congregation or community. But notice what it says in point number 2. The reproof should always be announced to the congregation if the committee has specific reason to believe that the congregation needs to be on guard concerning the repentant individual. For example, in a case involving CSA, an announcement would serve as protection for the congregation. Now, when I'm reading that, I'm wondering, why? In what sort of case would someone who has been part of CSA only be reproved? A reproof is the lighter punishment in the Jehovah's Witness world. So why would something that severe ever deserve a lighter punishment? I mean, once again, if we compare Jehovah's organization to Satan's system, in Satan's system, issues dealing with CSA usually result in a 5 to 20 year sentence. And after you get out of jail or prison, you then have to register as an offender. And we'll talk more about that in the coming chapter. Now compare that to Jehovah's organization, where somebody dealing with CSA can get the basically hand slap punishment of being publicly reproved. It is insane to me how something so serious, something that is punished so severely in the real world, can be handled so lightly within this organization that claims to be the best of the best, claims to have moral superiority. Now, after all the talk about reproof, we get to point number 12, which talks about removed from the congregation. And for people that have been away from the Jehovah's Witnesses for a while, this is a new updated term that basically replaces disfellowshipping. However, the results of it are still very much the same. And then after it goes through all the details about being removed from the organization, then it goes into disassociation and everything that would be considered an act of disassociation. And this includes things like accepting a blood transfusion, attending another church, of course, actually saying that you no longer wish to be a Jehovah's Witness and you no longer recognize the witnesses to be God's one and only organization. And so that brings us to chapter 8, helping individuals to return to the congregation. And this chapter goes through all of these things that are handled after a person has been either disassociated or more likely when a person has been removed from the congregation. And this is where we get to one of the differences between the old disfellowshipping way and this new removed way, which is that elders are encouraged to meet with the removed person every 6 months or so, to check in with them and keep them on the track to basically get to the point of being reinstated. Now, this is a lot different than the disfellowshipping arrangement, where as soon as you were disfellowshipped, you are on your own. And you can write letter after letter after letter until finally the elders say, okay, you're repentant enough, now you can come back. Now, if you ask me, I think the real purpose of this change is that it will prevent people from altogether leaving the organization. Now, if they get removed, they are still in contact with the elders. They're still being checked in on. Yes, they are shunned, but the shunning is just ever so slightly softer, so it keeps people locked in. Versus just being completely isolated, you're on your own. Now you are much more likely to leave the organization. So in a way, this is the organization's attempt to eliminate that group of people who are physically out but mentally in. Now, one thing of interest is in point number 17 regarding, of course, CSA, which is a pretty common issue in this book, which kind of says a lot, but let's read that. It says, if the individual was removed for CSA, the coordinator of the body of elders should contact the circuit overseer and provide the names of those who served on the original committee. The circuit overseer will designate an experienced elder to serve as chairman of the reinstatement committee. And once again, we see he may be from another congregation in the circuit. Thereafter, the body of elders should select other members of the committee. If the decision is to reinstate, 2 elders serving on the committee should immediately call the service department. This call must be made before the individual is informed of the decision and before the reinstatement is announced to the congregation. Now, once again, we see when it comes to issues of CSA, it's those 4 words: call the service department. Now, it's really important to note here, in this section, we are talking about someone who knowingly committed CSA. So we're talking about a known abuser here, a known abuser. Once again, CSA is a crime punishable by 5 to 20 years in jail or prison. And then after serving that sentence, they have to register as an offender. Why? Because that helps to keep other children safe. So that way this person is prevented from going in places where they might have easier access to those children. So it is insane to me. Once again, we see how softly this is being handled. And that kind of brings us right into chapter 9. Chapter 9 is all about child abuse. Now, in this chapter, the organization attempts to wash their hands of the issue right away. They step into BS land right from the first point. So let's read that here real quick. Point number 1 says, "These scriptures place the responsibility on parents to teach their children and protect them from abuse. Our publications and website contain much information to assist parents to protect their children from abuse." So here we see right from point number 1, the organization is trying to wash their hands of this issue. They're trying to put all the responsibility onto the parents. And look, it is the parents' responsibility to protect their children and to teach their children how to stay safe, teach their children how to be smart. However, parents can only do so much. It is also up to the society to help put up barriers that also help to protect children. So in the regular world, again, we have the offenders list. That prevents known abusers from going to certain places and doing certain things, working certain jobs. But in the Jehovah's Witnesses and groups like them, I have to emphasize and groups like them, because this is an issue that goes beyond just the witnesses, all right? There are many of these religions out there that have known abusers, okay? These are confirmed people who have done CSA, known abusers. And they do not report them to the authorities. Therefore, they do not have to be registered as offenders. Therefore, they can continue to go out into the regular world and do things and go to places that a registered offender would not be able to do. And this creates an environment where, as hard as parents can try, these abusers have much easier access to children. Now, in point number 3, we see something very important which regards mandatory reporting. So let's see what this says. Child abuse is a crime. See right there, they admit it. The elder's handling of an allegation of child abuse is not intended to replace the secular authorities' handling of the matter. Elders comply with child abuse reporting laws and will not shield anyone guilty of such crimes from the secular authorities. Therefore, the victim, her parents, or anyone else who reports such an allegation to the elders should be clearly informed that they are free to report the matters to secular authorities. Elders do not criticize anyone who chooses to make such a report. Now, similar to that point in chapter 2, this at first seems like a step in the right direction. And in some ways it is, because they're saying that they're not going to get in the way. They're not going to discourage people from reporting to the authorities. However, again, this is not doing enough. This is them washing their hands of the issue. In reality, elders should be mandatory reporters. If an elder has knowledge that a child is going through the traumatic experience of CSA, that elder should be responsible for doing a report on his own. Now, also notice what it says about elders cooperating with reporting laws. This is very, very important. This is why we are really trying to push to get mandatory reporting required in all 50 states. Because if mandatory reporting is required, then elders, as soon as they learn of the issue, they will be legally required to report these crimes to the authorities. Without mandatory reporting, the elders can hear about the issues and they can continue to do what they have done for decades, which is to handle the issue in-house, right? The person goes through a committee process, they get removed. After a while, they get reinstated, and that just opens the door for the issue to continue again, which in some cases it has. We have seen issues where we have a victim of CSA who finally comes forward and fights it. And through the investigation, we learned that actually this abuser was already known from years ago. They moved to another area and they get reinstated and they continue on with this abuse. The mandatory reporting law would also make sure that people who were not given the protection that they should have been given will be able to get the justice that they deserve. There have been many lawsuits from the Jehovah's Witnesses and other organizations. Again, we got to mention and other organizations. It's not just a Jehovah's Witness issue. But there have been many lawsuits with these organizations where you have someone who is a known abuser. It doesn't get reported. A victim comes forward. They fight it. They sue the organization. They win. And then the case ends up getting overturned simply because the issue happened in a state that did not have mandatory reporting. Therefore, the organization is acting within its rights to literally hide known pedophiles. I just got to say, for all these people who are fighting and speaking out to get the Epstein files released, and I'm fully on board with that, trust me. But if we put that same effort into getting the files released from all of these religious organizations who do not report known abusers to the authorities, I'm sure those files will make the Epstein's files look like an anthill compared to a mountain. These religions have spent millions of tax-free money, by the way, to fight these cases and to keep their known abusers hidden. They can hide behind religious freedoms and confidentiality clauses. And that's why it's so important that we get these things closed, get those loopholes closed. Even though these religions claim to be the Church of Jesus Christ, Jehovah's organization, etc., they have all these names that try to signify themselves as being the one true religion, the only religion that's doing things right, the purest of the pure. Even though they put on that front, it's these organizations who are hiding known abusers, allowing them to run free simply because they've done some period of repentance. And all too often, those abusers go on to be repeat offenders, which makes no sense to me. Because if you really believe that you are the Church of Jesus Christ, if you really believe you are Jehovah's one true organization, that you are chosen by God, that you are being guided by Jesus, or whatever it is that you believe, if you truly believe this stuff, then why wouldn't you do everything in your power to make sure that the children in your organization are safe? Why wouldn't you do everything in your power to make sure that people who commit a crime have to pay for that crime? It makes no sense to me, and quite frankly, it should be considered religious discrimination, that in the outside, if someone commits these crimes, they are facing 5 to 20 years in jail. And it's not going to be a very pleasant jail experience from what I've heard, because even amongst criminals, CSA is considered a big deal. But within these organizations that claim to be chosen by God, claim to be the purest of the pure, the most moral, if you do that same crime, you have to just talk to one of the leaders, explain yourself. You may perhaps get a stern talking to. You may perhaps get excommunicated for a certain amount of time, and then that's it. And so again, it is very important that we get mandatory reporting required in all 50 states. It doesn't necessarily mean that these religious groups will actually report, but it does mean that the law is requiring it, and therefore when it doesn't happen, they can at least get in trouble for it. Because right now they're getting away scot-free. Now, the other issue with this rule is that in normal society, any person who is an authority figure or who is put in a position where they are going to have direct access to children, teachers, counselors, police officers, right? Those type of positions are mandatory reporting positions, right? If you are a teacher and you hear about anything related to CSA or to other types of abuse, you are required by law to report that to the authorities, to report it to professionals, to help that child to get into a safer environment. It's insane that the elders are put in a position where they are to act as counselors, teachers, police officers, and yet they are not required to be mandatory reporters. Now, in point number 4 of this chapter, we read about how they handle CSA allegations. So let's read that. It says, when elders learn of an allegation of child abuse, even if the alleged abuse occurred many years ago, 2 elders should immediately call the service department. And so once again, we see those 4 words, call the service department. And what happens then? Okay, we've seen reports where nothing happens. We've seen reports where the service department tells the elders, well, due to your state not having a mandatory reporting law, you are to keep this a confidential matter, remove the person from the congregation, and that's the end of it. So now we get into a very interesting section, which is point number 7. And this goes into all the different things that is not considered CSA from a congregation point of view. Very, very interesting stuff. Let's go through this list. From a congregation standpoint, CSA does not refer to the following. 1, a minor who is a willing participant and who is approaching adulthood is involved in activity with an adult who is a few years older. Number 2 speaks about minors who have been engaged with one another. And then number 3, very, very interesting. It says viewing CP. This is such a serious issue, I can't even say it, so I just have to say CP. Viewing CP. However, viewing CP is still a serious violation of Jehovah's standards. Depending on the frequency and the extent of the wrongdoing, the matter could be handled by means of strong counsel. In some cases, it will be necessary to form a committee. If the elders determine that it is necessary to form a committee, they should contact the service department. Now, point number 1 is very interesting because in the real world, that's called statutory, and that's still a crime. This just opens the door for people to groom minors, and we do see this pretty often in the Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, in the paragraph, it mentions someone who is a few years older, so perhaps a case where you have someone who is 16 or 17 and is with someone who is 20, 21 years old. Now, in that case, in the regular world, that would be considered statutory. That's a crime. Why is it in the Jehovah's Witnesses that is not taken seriously? And since they don't take it seriously, it extends far beyond just a few years. We know this. We know that it is normalized in the Jehovah's Witnesses to have typically a man who is, 30s, sometimes even approaching 40s, who is showing interest in someone who has not reached the age of 18 yet, but who shortly after a girl turns 18, they will get married. Now, things are far more concerning with point number 3, which is regarding the CP. Again, I can't even say the words. I just have to say CP because it is taken so seriously out here in the regular world, right? But in their case, this is something that they handle softly. Number 1, they don't consider it CSA from a congregation standpoint, which is insane to me. And number 2, they suggest that depending on the severity of it, a person who is looking at CP may need to get a talking to, may need to get some counsel. In a case where the committee does need to be formed, it's of course, follow those 4 words, call the service department, right? And it's insane to me because we talked about CSA in general being a crime out in the regular world. That's 5 to 20 years. CP, on the other hand, is anywhere from 5 to 22 years. So it actually carries the potential of a higher sentence than standard CSA. And again, the sentencing depends on the severity and how long it is and the states and all that. But regardless, this is considered a crime. People go to jail for CP. This is not something that you just get a talking to. So now we skip down to the subheading, how elders contribute to child protection. This is still in the same chapter. Now, point number 11 is very, very interesting. Let's read that. It says, at times, secular authorities may inform the elders that a sex offender is living in the area. They may also provide his address and state the nature of his crime. In such a case, the elder should list that address on the appropriate congregation territory card as a do not call. This is fascinating to me, how the secular authorities provide a list of known offenders, and the elders will take that list and list that house as a do not call. So when it's coming from the outside in, they are happy to take advantage of the things that are put in place by the authorities to protect children from known offenders. However, they are not willing to extend that same courtesy back to the outside world, to tell the outside world about their known offenders. This is just plain hypocrisy, is really what it is. And this is a case where, I don't understand how people can blindly believe that this is the true religion, but yet they have policies like this. Now, in point number 13, we see what restrictions and direction the service department will provide when it comes to all of those situations. And this is kind of interesting. It says, the service department will provide direction that will include restrictions on the person's congregation activities. The elder should caution the person to never be alone with a minor, not to cultivate friendships with minors, not to display affection for minors, and so forth. The service department may direct the elders to alert the believing parents of minors within the congregation of the need to monitor their children's interaction with the person. The elders would take this step only if directed to do so by the service department. The elders should carefully adhere to all direction provided by the service department. So very interesting statements there in point number 13. It does allow some cases where perhaps the elders may be allowed to warn the parents within the congregation to protect their children when it comes to this person. But it seems to be that that is a rare thing to happen. And every case that I have known, that has never happened. The parents of the congregations have never been warned that they have a known abuser in their congregation. Now, furthermore, even in the case where the elders are allowed to warn the parents, again, when it comes to assemblies, when it comes to conventions, when it comes to that person visiting other congregations, when it comes to that person going out in the ministry, these are all cases where they cannot provide protection, where this person may have access to potentially more victims. And it should really be up to the organization to find some sort of way where they can continually provide protection for children from people who are known abusers. There's got to be some ethical way where they can do that rather than just saying, well, it's the parent's responsibility to keep the children safe. Because if you are actively putting people in the congregation and in the environments who are known abusers, you are working against the parents. And of course, you have situations when it comes to employment, people who work as teachers, people who work in daycares, people who just babysit, right? These are situations that the congregation is not over, right? It has nothing to do with meetings. So are they going ahead and telling these employers, hey, this person is a known abuser? Or are they saying, well, we dealt with it in the congregation, so that's where our responsibility ends. Now, if we watch the ARC recordings, we know that the organization has the attitude of, it's not our problem when it comes to protecting children that are outside of the organization, even though they are contributing to the dangers of children that are outside of the organization. So that gets us into chapter 10, which focuses on medical issues. Now, as you would imagine, this chapter is mostly about the blood issue and the hospital liaison committee. There's really not too much interesting going on in this chapter, but that's what it's all about. Chapter 11 is all about security incidents and disasters. And this chapter is all about how to take care of the congregation in the event of a disaster. And this kind of shows the nicer side of the Jehovah's Witnesses, the nice side of being part of a community like this. Because in the event of a disaster, isn't it nice to have a community that is watching out for each other? That's the nice part about it. But it's unfortunate that that nice aspect of being part of that sort of community also has to come with so much negative aspects and so much controlling aspects. Moving on to chapter 12, this is about legal matters and public information. So this goes into all sorts of legal issues. Again, CSA definitely comes up again in this chapter. This talks about how elders are not to act as secular authority figures. And it's kind of interesting reading this chapter and yet seeing again how they handle things that are crimes. literally crimes, things that people go to jail for in the regular world. And they decide to handle it with this very underhanded punishment in the organization. So in that case, they definitely are acting as a sort of replacement for secular authority figures. If you are covering over somebody's crime, call it what it is. Chapter 13 is all about the Kingdom Hall. This goes into caring for the hall, building halls, selling halls, basically everything related to Kingdom Halls. So again, one of those chapters that there's not much interesting going on, and it was a little bit interesting for me because during the time I was a ministerial servant, I was assigned the duty of Kingdom Hall maintenance. But other than that, this chapter is exactly what you would expect. Chapter number 14 is about pioneers, and again, it's a chapter that is exactly what you would expect. It talks about the pioneering requirements, the appointments, deletions of pioneers. Now, the only interesting thing that really caught my attention in this chapter was point number 13 regarding minors. Here's what it says. Elders should be cautious about encouraging minors to pioneer. Pioneering should be a personal expression of one's faith, not the result of pressure from parents or others. It is very, very ironic to see a paragraph like this written from the organization that in many, many, many cases does encourage minors to pioneer. We've seen all sorts of situations where people who are baptized at 9 years old and start pioneering at 12 years old are put on a pedestal. That brings us to chapter 15, Circuit Overseers. And surprisingly, it's a pretty short chapter. I was expecting to see more about the circuit overseer position, but all this chapter was about was how to encourage the congregation to rally up during the circuit overseer's visit. Chapter 16 is all about multi-language fields. And this talks about the handling of multiple cultures in the same area, what the requirements are for making a special group, and when to go on from a special group into a full-on new language congregation. So again, not too much interesting stuff in this chapter, although for myself, being in a very multicultural area was kind of interesting just because I've seen several groups go from just small special groups within the congregation to then branching out into their own full congregation with their own full territory. And it's pretty fascinating to see. So that brings us to chapter 17. Correspondence and records. Now, for the most part, this is all about how elders should handle confidential matters and how records should be kept within the congregation. Now, the interesting thing in this chapter comes from point number 6, which proves that all congregations do have records of known abusers. So again, we have to ask, well, why aren't those records being shared with the general public? If we go back to chapter 9, we see that point when it comes to secular authorities and how they use those records of known abusers to protect the congregation, to list those houses as do not calls, right? So it's insane to me that the congregation has records in place. They have a procedure to keep these records, but yet they don't share it with the authorities. And again, I just have to stress, this is why it's so important that we get mandatory reporting required in all 50 states. Now, beyond the United States, I don't know the laws. I'm sure there's something of an equivalent that should also be required, in those lands. But when it comes to the United States, it is insane to me that we have 50 states here, and there's some states that have that requirement, but there's other states that don't. And here in my home state of Washington, we were on the roll of getting that to be a requirement. But sadly, due to pressure from the Catholic Church, that rule got written out. So we are one step back once again. But truly, this is very, very important. There is no good reason, no good excuse why any of these religious organizations should be able to have known knowledge and records of known abusers when it comes to CSA, and then not report that to the authorities to help protect both children within the organizations and children that are outside. No excuse for that. All right, we're almost done here. Now we get to Appendix A. And Appendix A is all about matters requiring the formation of a committee. Now, as you would expect, much of this appendix centers on the subject of sex, because if there's any one thing that gets the most people in trouble, it's sex. But after we get through all the sex stuff, we get a very interesting point in point number 21. And this kind of relates to the subject of shunning, now that the Watchtower has changed this disfellowshipping into removed. So let's see what point 21 says. Unnecessary association with persons who have been removed from the congregation or who have disassociated themselves. There is a difference between simply greeting a person who has been removed from the congregation or who has disassociated himself and socializing with him. A committee should be formed if, despite repeated counsel, an individual willfully and continually engages in unnecessary association with a non-relative who has been removed from the congregation or who has disassociated himself. So this goes to show the shunning policy is still in effect here. The only real change is that when it comes to people who have been removed from the congregation, you can give a simple greeting if they are coming to meetings and if they are progressing towards being reinstated. Anything that goes beyond a simple greeting is grounds for being called into a committee. That's how serious they take it. So shunning is still in full effect, and it is such in effect that you can get disciplined for not following the shunning rule. Now, it mentions here with non-relatives, and I would assume that this is just the case where you would have to associate with someone who is a relative who is disassociated or removed from the congregation that still lives in your house. But I would imagine that relatives that do not live in the same household would still follow under the condition of you are not supposed to associate with them beyond a simple greeting at the meetings. And of course, when it comes to apostates, we see point number 22, which says, a committee should be formed if, despite repeated counsel, an individual persists in associating with a relative who is promoting apostate teachings or wrong conduct. So here, even if it is a relative, when it comes to apostasy, when it comes to spreading any sort of negative information or being critical of the organization or simply saying this is not the truth, you are to have no contact. So now we get into Appendix B, which is all about scriptural freedom to remarry. And it's kind of interesting that this would get its own appendix. That shows how much they are involved in people's lives. Now let's read point number 2 here because it's very interesting. It says scriptural freedom to remarry requires all of the following 3 conditions. Number 1, sexual immorality, a rejection, refusal to reconcile by the innocent mate, and 3, a legal final divorce. It is the responsibility of the individual desiring to remarry to provide evidence to the elders that he is scripturally free to do so. If an individual's divorce occurred before baptism, the elders should not assume he is scripturally free to remarry, as baptism does not dissolve previous marital ties. Now, this whole section is very interesting to me because, again, it shows how much they are involved in people's lives. But number 2 is because it does end up in some very sticky situations that really have no true way of being solved. So I'll give you a couple examples. The first example is a woman who was in a neighboring congregation of mine. And all the congregations would go out and play sports together. So she was known in several different congregations. And there was a lot of men who were actually interested in this sister. The issue was she was not scripturally free to remarry. Reason being that before she became a witness, she had gotten married when she was very young. She was living a completely different life. She was actually in the army at that time. So really, a completely different life. Things didn't work out. She decided to get a divorce. Later on, she became a witness. And yet, she was still not scripturally free to remarry. Of course, after all those years had passed and moving to a different state, she did not know the status of her ex-husband. Therefore, she's stuck. And again, there was people interested in her, but they're stuck. Now, in another example, this one actually kind of made the rounds around the XJW community. You had a man from my area who had moved here from another state, and an elder from my area, I actually know this elder, was coming to his house, pretty much harassing this guy, knocking on his door, parking outside of his house, watching him. And when the guy eventually opened the door and spoke to the elder, and he got a recording of it, the elder basically explained that this person's ex-wife, from when he was a witness, who was living in his previous state, was desiring to get remarried. And that wife needed to know if that man had been with anybody else in their time apart. So, I mean, just imagine that you're not in the witnesses anymore, right? You've gotten away from the religion. You moved to a whole different state. And your ex-wife, who is still a witness, needs to send elders to your house to spy on you, to try to confirm if you have slept with anybody else so that she can be free to get remarried. These are the kind of sticky situations that end up happening when an organization gets that involved in your personal life. And lastly, we get to Appendix C, which is work performed at Kingdom Halls. And this chapter generally goes through all the maintenance of the Kingdom Hall and which layers of maintenance requires general public versus which layers would require somebody from the LDC, somebody who has some sort of certification to do a certain level of maintenance work. So that's basically what that appendix is all about. So that is a full overview of the Elders book. A pretty interesting book. And again, if you want a deeper look into the book, I definitely recommend going out, downloading the book. You can type it into Google. You can find it very, very easily. And you can get a PDF copy and you can see this stuff for yourself. I'd highly, highly recommend it. Now, after going through this book, there's definitely some things that come to mind. Number one, why was this book kept secret? There's nothing in this book that should be kept secret from the general congregation. In fact, there's a lot in this book that the general congregation should know about. Now, secondly, as I said at the beginning of the video, it's just crazy to see in all the different ways, in all the very inappropriate ways, how these elders are required to be the counselors, the teachers, the mentors, the judges, the police officers, among many other things for the congregation. And there's just no way that any man can wear all those hats effectively. No way at all, especially when many of those things require specialized training. Now, lastly, and this is something that I mentioned in my previous video, when you read this book, you really see how the organization does not view its members as adults. They do not view their members as fully independent adults. They do not trust their members. You see this throughout this book in many different ways. And this is something that I definitely noticed whenever somebody became a new elder, there would be this immediate change in them, just immediate. And I think that is a very big part of it. In fact, I actually had one elder tell me shortly after I became a ministerial servant that when you become a servant, you are going to view the congregation differently. And when you become an elder, it will be even more different. And that person was right. And after reading this book, I can see that they're even more right. Because yes, after studying this book, if I was put in a position where I had to follow along with this book and view my congregation in the way that this book is telling me to view them, then yes, I would have a very different view of my brothers and sisters. But I would say above all else, when I read this book, I am reminded, as I have said many times throughout this video, that this organization holds the safety of women and the safety of children at a much lower priority than what we see in the outside world. So how they can do that and yet refer to the outside world as being Satan's system and a wicked world and corrupt world, and yet not provide those same safety measures for the people who are most vulnerable, I just don't get that. That is my overview of the Elders book. Very, very fascinating book to read, especially after being away from the organization for so long. It's insane to me how much they are getting into people's business, how much they view themselves as being responsible for people's lives. We're talking about full-grown adults here. And they truly think that it is their responsibility to be the caretakers for full-grown adults. And it's no wonder that with an attitude like that, that we do see this situation where Jehovah's Witnesses are not really allowed to grow. Because if you are an adult and yet you view the elders as being responsible over you rather than you being responsible over you, of course, you're not really going to grow in those ways. So with all that being said, I want to thank you so much for watching. Thank you for your time. I know this was a long video. Hopefully you guys got something out of it. Thank you so much for your time. Take it easy on yourself and stay tuned for the next one. Peace.